Good afternoon to all you lovely people. My name is The Advocate, and today I'm an advocate for George R.R. Martin and Tetsuya Nomura. More alike than you think? Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Seeing as how I'm pretty deep into this A Song of Ice and Fire thing, I figure there's no point in swimming back up to the surface, and I might as well keep diving deeper into this crazy world. And in typical A Song of Ice and Fire fandom fashion, I find myself thinking on the creator of this wonderful A Song of Ice and Fire world, Mr. George R.R. Martin himself. In addition, as I've amused myself in attempting to unravel this famous author in modern fantasy, I also find myself thinking on another author. An author who's responsible for another large fantasy franchise on this planet. That author being principal video game designer and head writer for the Kingdom Hearts franchise, Mr. Tetsuya Nomura himself. Now, I'm not sure if there's much overlap between the A Song of Ice and Fire fanbase and the Kingdom Hearts fanbase, so this video might not be of much interest to many people. However, I thought it would be a nice exercise to compare both of these individuals and share with you all in the many ways in which both authors, and by extension their work, are similar. Now, before we get started on the video proper, I just want to give a heads up that I will be discussing published material for both the A Song of Ice and Fire series and the Kingdom Hearts series. If you have not read the A Song of Ice and Fire books or played the Kingdom Hearts games, please consider clicking off this video before continuing, because I will be delving into heavy spoilers for both series. Additionally, portions of this video will contain my opinion on both of these men as writers. Please understand that this is my opinion and not an attack on either man for who they are or an attack on the opinions of others. So, with all that out of the way, let's get started. Now, on the surface, both men appear to not share too many commonalities. They are of different nationalities and live halfway across the world from each other. They work on two completely separate modes of entertainment, and their ideology on tropes is in stark contrast with one another. However, they do share some pretty large similarities that are hard to overlook. Both are the brainchildren responsible for their respective multi-million-dollar franchise. Both have written a large catalog of entries in their respective fictional universe, and both have been resoundingly criticized for their writing style and approach to storytelling. Through their works of fiction, both authors have also inadvertently created passionate fandoms for their work, fandoms which have gone through various iterations of discourse and split opinions. However, these similarities are rather surface level and can be said of most any two fictional writers. What I want to do is compare both George R.R. Martin and Tetsuya Nomura on a deeper level and take a look at 4 ways in which both men are alike. Those 4 similarities include publication history, gardening, open-ended storytelling, and both men's reliance on retcons. Let's take it from the top, people. In terms of publication history, both creators are notorious for delaying a hotly anticipated title, building on years of hype and anticipation, and then releasing holdover material that each respective fandom did not necessarily ask for during the wait period for that anticipated title. In the case of Tetsuya Nomura, after the release of Kingdom Hearts 2 in 2006, fans were eager to play the sequel, which they believed to be the next number title in the series, Kingdom Hearts 3. However, Nomura-san had other plans and would instead go on to release other games in the franchise which did not carry a number in the title. Although these games expanded the lore and were even integral in understanding the overall story for the Kingdom Hearts series, they lacked the scope, budget, and climactic story implications of the previous numbered entries, Kingdom Hearts 1 and 2. These side games were generally well received, however many fans vented their frustration with Nomura over the lack of an actual Kingdom Hearts 3. Some fans even derided the necessity of these games, which they perceived as side ventures that only served to distract Nomura from writing the scenario for the game that fans actually wanted to play. It was not until June 10, 2013 that a trailer for Kingdom Hearts 3 was finally shown to the public, confirming years of speculation that Mr. Nomura and the developers at Square Enix, the company in charge of the Kingdom Hearts franchise, were hard at work on the next numbered title in the series. Unfortunately for fans, Kingdom Hearts 3 would be repeatedly delayed and would not see a proper release until January of 2019, 6 years after development of the game had been confirmed. Similarly, in George R.R. Martin's case, after the release of A Dance with Dragons on July 12, 2011, fans of the A Song of Ice and Fire universe were repeatedly asking George when the next title, the 6th book in the series called The Winds of Winter, would be released. George would frequently answer these questions with estimates for publication dates that wound up never being correct. Repeated delays in the release of Mr. Martin's own side ventures frustrated many fans. Although Dunk and Egg and to a lesser extent the Fire and Blood series were met with positive reviews, Many A Song of Ice and Fire fans questioned the necessity of these books and wanted to know when The Winds of Winter would finally be released. A question that tragically many fans, myself included, are still asking to this day. Kingdom Hearts 3 spent 6 years in development and did not see the light of day until 13 years after the release of Kingdom Hearts 2. Unfortunately, in spite of the hype, Kingdom Hearts 3 was met with a mixed reception amongst its fan base upon release. Despite improvements to the gameplay formula, the story became weighted down by a continuously expanding lore that retcons the events of the first couple of entries into the series, a growing lore that was impenetrable for new fans and needlessly convoluted for a large portion of the existing fans. Additionally, the years of anticipation did not do the game any favors, and Kingdom Hearts 3 was unable to meet the nearly astronomical expectations placed on it. The Winds of Winter has also spent a considerable amount of time in development since the release of A Dance with Dragons a decade ago, and anticipation for The Winds of Winter is akin to that of Kingdom Hearts 3 prior to its release. Like Kingdom Hearts, the A Song of Ice and Fire series has also seen an exponential growth in lore with each new entry into the series. The Winds of Winter runs the risk of being potentially overwhelmed by a large quantity of narrative threads that George R.R. Martin will need to be in peak form in order to properly tie up the threads without compromising on reader comprehension or prose. He will need to avoid a Kingdom Hearts 3 which predominantly only serviced the principal story thread, while hastily tying together only some of the other story threads near the end of the game. On a personal level, I've also been trying to keep my expectations in check. People have waited 10 years for The Winds of Winter. Something tells me that despite all the goodwill built by the first 5 books in the main series, the 6th book will not be able to meet the lofty expectations created by a decade and counting of wait time. As far as the philosophies of both men's writing style is concerned, both Tetsuya Nomura and George R.R. Martin have professed to being gardeners of their material. In a 2011 interview with The Guardian, George explains, "I think there are 2 types of writers, the architects and the gardeners. The architects plan everything ahead of time, like an architect building a house. They have the whole thing designed and blueprinted out before they even nail the first board up. The gardeners dig a hole, drop in a seed, and water it. They kind of know what seed it is, they know if they planted a fantasy seed or mystery seed or whatever. But as the plant comes up and they water it, they don't know how many branches it's going to have. They find out as it grows. I'm much more of a gardener than an architect." All this to say that George R.R. Martin essentially writes his story as he goes along. In 1993, during the writing phase for his first book, A Game of Thrones, George provided a letter to his publishers that set the foundation for his gardener approach to the Song of Ice and Fire series. "As you know, I don't outline my novels. I find that if I know exactly where a book is going, I lose all interest in writing. I do, however, have some strong notion as to the overall structure of the story I'm telling, and the eventual fate of many of the principal characters in the drama." Almost paradoxically, George then goes on to provide a version of an outline for that first book where he states, "I have quite a clear notion of how the story is going to unfold in the first volume, A Game of Thrones. Things will get a lot worse for the poor Starks before they get better, I'm afraid. Lord Eddard Stark and his wife Catelyn Tully are both doomed and will perish at the hands of their enemies. Ned will be accused of treason, but before he is taken he will help his wife and his daughter Arya escape back to Winterfell." Now, upon hearing this information, book readers and even viewers of the Game of Thrones TV show will immediately notice that this provided synopsis does not coincide with neither the published material for the Game of Thrones book, nor the first season of the TV show. Although George had a vision for an end goal to the book in mind, he clearly deviated at some point during the writing process, and published a book that was different from his original outline. He essentially wrote a couple of chapters, saw where the story was going, and from there decided that Arya, instead of fleeing with Catelyn, was instead going to escape King's Landing on her own, whilst Catelyn was going to be with her son Robb instead of heading back to Winterfell. George also provided synopses for A Dance with Dragons and The Winds of Winter, the 2 sequels he planned to write as part of the originally intended trilogy, and similarly, those synopses are also very different from what was eventually published. George changing the events that he originally intended to write proves that he values his gardener approach to storytelling. He sees something in a story that wasn't originally planned, but could potentially provide a more interesting branch for his garden, and grows the story from there. In the same vein, Tetsuya Nomura has gone on record to state that he is a gardener of his material as well. When asked if he had everything planned out ahead of time concerning the story in the Kingdom Hearts franchise, Mr. Nomura explained, "Typically I plan 1 sequel ahead of whatever that I am working on. When I was working on the original Kingdom Hearts, I was thinking about Kingdom Hearts Chain of Memories. For Kingdom Hearts 2 and Roxas, I was thinking of starting a game with a new protagonist, but I didn't have a concrete vision at the time. Like George R.R. Martin, Tetsuya Nomura also writes his story as he goes along. Evidence of Mr. Nomura's gardener-style writing is present throughout the whole series, but one of the earliest examples of this is in Kingdom Hearts 1. Various non-playable characters comment on the fact that the game's protagonist, Sora, is the Keyblade's chosen one. However, subsequent entries into the series disprove that notion, as we later see that there are multiple Keyblade wielders and not a singular chosen one. Additionally, during a pivotal moment in Kingdom Hearts 1, Sora stabs himself with a Keyblade that can free people's hearts in order to release the heart of his love interest, Kairi. In stabbing himself, Sora inadvertently created a heartless and a nobody. If the 2020 Dengeki interview with Nomura-san is to be believed, Nomura only had a vague notion as to the identity of Roxas, whom we later in Kingdom Hearts 2 find out is a nobody. He did not have a concrete vision for the concept of nobodies, nor what they represent when writing Kingdom Hearts 1. He would only begin to explore and expand on the idea of the creation of a nobody after the release of the first game. Now before I continue, some of you may be thinking that I am taking a stab at both George and Tetsuya for the decision to write a story as they go along. Far from it, I actually respect both authors' willingness to let the story kind of morph into its own creature and allow the narrative to go with the flow. If written with care, both a spontaneous garden story and a planned architect story do have their merits, and neither one is necessarily better than the other. However, if left unchecked, a garden story can grow into a tangled, brambled mess that is too big for its own good. This is especially true if the authors do not take the time to actually prune the leaves and trim the loose ends on their story. With each new iteration of the A Song of Ice and Fire series and Kingdom Hearts series, George R.R. Martin and Tetsuya Nomura introduced new rules and plot lines into the respective universe. In typical garden fashion, the quantity of rules increases exponentially, and it often seems like it won't stop growing. On top of that, not only do both men need to verify that the story presented in each new entry abides by the rules of that entry, but they also need to verify that the rules of the new entry follow the logic of all the previously established rules in their respective franchise. Additionally, both men need to check that the logic presented in previously published material is not going to contradict the rules of the new entry. It can get confusing, but both writers have shown that they enjoy their garden and are sticking to it despite the possible migraine. Now, although the labyrinth of rules and logic is enough to discourage most authors from writing like a gardener, this form of storytelling clearly has not stopped George nor Tetsuya from abiding by this writing philosophy. In fact, both men embrace their gardener mentality by intentionally writing open-ended story elements, which they then try to write their way out of in later entries. They insert narrative questions that incite the audience to ask, "What does this mean?" At this point in the story, neither the audience nor the author actually knows the answer to this narrative question. However, once the author has figured out how they want to address that question, they come back to it in a later entry in the series with an answer that they hope will garner a satisfactory payoff. Tetsuya slightly elaborates on this in a 2014 Los Angeles interview. Here he says, "Even if you don't know a certain element while you're playing the game now, sometimes it's foreshadowing something coming up ahead, and you'll find out after you play further along in the series. That's the part that makes a complex story interesting." In Kingdom Hearts Chain of Memories, we are introduced to a location unique to the game called Castle Oblivion. We don't know why the castle exists nor its significance in the story, if it even has significance, but the point is, the castle is there. Nomura, who has gone on record to state that he only thinks one game ahead of time, is not sure of the importance of this place during the writing for Chain of Memories either. Regardless, he allows Castle Oblivion to play center stage in this game, and it is not until 3 games later that he finds an answer to our question, what the heck is this place? In Kingdom Hearts Birth by Sleep, we finally learn that the castle is the long-lost ruins of a place called Land of Departure, an ancient dwelling that once housed a few Keyblade masters. The castle was intended to hide secrets, such as a plucky young apprentice named Ventus, who was hidden away in the deepest sanctum of the castle in order to prevent any of the villains from doing him harm. Similarly, in the Game of Thrones book, George R.R. Martin introduces readers to the Walder Frey character, the proud, stubborn lord of House Frey. Although George wasn't sure how Lord Frey would play into the story when writing this book, he knew that Lord Frey would eventually play some devious role down the line. Negative descriptors of Mr. Frey used by Catelyn Stark, such as "the late Lord Frey" and "my father mistrusts him," clue us in that Walder is not a nice man. However, because George had not come up with the concept of the Red Wedding quite yet, George wasn't sure what purpose Lord Frey would play in the story besides crotchety old man who we shouldn't trust.
As far as George knew, Robb Stark was going to die in battle and not by violation of guest right perpetrated by Mr. Frey. All the North will be inflamed by war. Robb will win several splendid victories and maim Joffrey Baratheon on the battlefield, but in the end, he will not be able to stand against Jaime and Tyrion Lannister and their allies. Robb Stark will die in battle, and Tyrion Lannister will besiege and burn Winterfell. It was not until the next book that George finally settled on the idea of the Red Wedding and decided to change Robb's cause of death from battle to betrayal. This is evidenced by heavy foreshadowing present in A Clash of Kings when Daenerys ventures through the House of the Undying. Farther on, she came upon a feast of corpses. Savagely slaughtered, the feasters lay strewn across overturned chairs and heckled trestle tables, asprawl in pools of congealing blood. Some had lost limbs, even heads. Severed hands clutched bloody cups, wooden spoons, roast fowl, heels of bread. In a throne above them sat a dead man with the head of a wolf. He wore an iron crown and held a leg of lamb in one hand, as a king might hold a scepter, and his eyes followed Dany with mute appeal. George thought up the idea of the Red Wedding after A Game of Thrones, foreshadowed it in A Clash of Kings, and completed the payoff in A Storm of Swords. He gave Lord Frey a purpose and had him be the key first-party conspirator in slaying Robb Stark. After rousing the reader to ask, who is this man Walder and what is his purpose? George eventually puzzles out an answer and gives Mr. Frey one of the highest profile purposes in fictional literature. The reader asked, the writer asked, and eventually the writer answered. Despite the previously provided examples of open-ended story elements that paid off in a satisfying way to most of the audience, not every resolution to a plot-inserted question fits snugly within the narrative of a story. Sometimes the payoff can be messy. Although enjoyment of fictional writing is subjective, there is something to be said about narrative threads that appeared to have been planned from the very beginning and narrative threads that were clearly only thought up much later in the series. What I'm referring to, of course, is the abuse of a retcon. Now, critics of both the A Song of Ice and Fire and Kingdom Hearts franchises will sometimes use the word retcon interchangeably with plot hole in order to cast a less favorable light on either series. Although it is fair to point out the mistakes in the works of both Nomura and Martin, using the word retcon as a simile for plot error is technically incorrect. Short for retroactive continuity, a retcon is a piece of new information that imposes a different interpretation on previously described events. Examples of Martin using retcons to twist our interpretation of previously established events in the A Song of Ice and Fire franchise include Aegon Targaryen, son of Rhaegar, actually being alive and well. The babe that was killed during Robert's rebellion was an imposter. Magister Illyrio Mopetus wants to help Viserys get back on the Iron Throne. No, wait, he wants Aegon on the throne. Tyrion loves showing off that he's an acrobatic. Well, actually, he only does it sparingly and when his family elders aren't looking. Cersei Lannister's paranoia stems from a prophecy provided by fortune-teller Maggie the Frog, who states that a new young queen will spell the end for Cersei. Examples of Nomura using retcons include the hooded figure at the beginning of Kingdom Hearts 1 is not actually Ansem Seeker of Darkness, but the heartless form of an imposter calling himself Ansem. Xemnas wants to give his Organization 13 comrades new hearts. No wait, psych! He wants to give them a piece of Xehanort's heart so they can all be Xehanort clones. Organization 13 has 13 members. Well, except for this one time when it had 14 members, but thanks to some convenient amnesia, no one remembers his 14th member. Maleficent came back to life because the three good fairies remembered her. No, wait, it was because she time-traveled back to the present after having her heart sent to the past when Ansem possessed Riku stabbed her in Kingdom Hearts 1. These events consist of information that was not originally known to the reader or player, but eventually became known at a later point in the series. Now, despite my tone of voice when mentioning some of the retcons present in both of these series, I personally do not think there is anything wrong with using retcon to add intrigue if it slips seamlessly into the plot of the story. However, in my opinion, both Nomura and Martin's attempts at twisting the narrative for interest's sake do not always work, and rather than expand the world or tie up a loose thread, just serve to convolute the story. Occasionally, I even feel that both writers do this as an attempt to make the story seem more complicated than it actually is. Again, this is subjective in my opinion, but going back to the list of retcons that I mentioned for both men, the one that really bothers me from George R.R. Martin is his writing of Illyrio's motivations. In A Game of Thrones, when Illyrio Mopatis is talking with Varys in the sewers of King's Landing, Illyrio makes it clear to the reader that he is working for the benefit of the Targaryen children. Nonetheless, we must have time. The princess is with child. The Khal will not bestir himself until his son is born. Illyrio asks Varys to delay the impending chaos in Westeros in order to give Viserys and Daenerys enough time to march the Dothraki Khalasar to King's Landing. Although Illyrio clearly mentions Daenerys with the princesses with child line, at no point in this book does he mention Aegon, son of Rhaegar, as part of his plan. Aegon's existence is only made known to the reader in A Dance with Dragons when Tyrion pieces together that Varys and Illyrio had hid Aegon away far across the Narrow Sea in order to falsify his death. Now yeah, one could easily explain away Illyrio's motivations by saying that, oh well, Illyrio had always supported Aegon from the very beginning, and Daenerys and Viserys were nothing more than pawns who Illyrio saw as being killed in his game. However, that thought is almost in contrast with his conversation in the sewers, and it seems more like something where George changed his mind on Illyrio's motivations for interest's sake. Sure, writers are allowed to change their mind as it's their own story. Heck, most fans will even get behind a change if it spices up the plot. However, a retcon that feels unplanned, it does pull you out of the story. Most especially if the audience needs to perform a few mental gymnastics in order to make the logic of the retcon work. Now, as far as Aegon Targaryen himself is concerned, I'm open-minded. There is a plethora of potential possibilities for how this young man's journey will pan out, and I'm excited to see where he and Jon Connington go in The Winds of Winter. However, the story of Aegon's origins through Illyrio does seem somewhat contrived and unnecessary in my opinion. Hindsight being 2020, if George had slightly altered Illyrio's dialogue in A Game of Thrones to something like, "We have a few plans in place," then maybe I would have bought into the fact that Illyrio had an Aegon plan in the works all along. In open-ended story fashion, George wouldn't even have to know what those plans were, but he would have sowed a seed in his garden that would have grown into the Aegon story. As is, though, it feels a little forced. Nomura, meanwhile, sees a retcon and takes it to the next level. At the beginning of Kingdom Hearts 1, Sora comes across a hooded individual who whispers to Sora that his world will be swallowed by darkness. In this same game, we later learn that this individual is named Ansem, former ruler of Hollow Bastion, who performed experiments on living people in order to create the heartless creatures you see roaming about the universe. So the audience immediately has it in their mind, okay, Ansem is hooded figure, he likes darkness, Ansem bad. Cool. However, in Kingdom Hearts 2, we later learn that that hooded individual wasn't actually Ansem himself, but a heartless version of an imposter named Xehanort who was calling himself Ansem. Okay. Ansem is Xehanort's heartless. Xehanort's heartless likes darkness. Xehanort's heartless bad. Not too complicated? Cool. But then, we add another layer on top of that, and in Birth by Sleep we find out that Xehanort is actually an old man who wants to swallow the world in darkness to bring balance to the Force. The Xehanort that we learn about in Kingdom Hearts 2 is actually the body of a young Keyblade apprentice named Terra, whose mind was taken over by Old Man Xehanort. This Terra-Xehanort combination was the one who was creating Heartless from the very beginning, and due to some convenient amnesia, doesn't remember that he was ever Old Man Xehanort. Okay, that recontextualizes a thing or two, but I'm still on board. Well, hold on to your butts, there's more. You see, in Kingdom Hearts Dream Drop Distance, we learned that Terra Xehanort's Heartless was actually waiting for Sora on the island the entire time. He traveled back to a time when a young version of himself, named Young Xehanort, lived on Destiny Island, so that Terra Xehanort's Heartless could grant young Xehanort the ability to time travel into the future and meet a version of himself across time. Terra Xehanort's Heartless then waited out the rest of his time on Destiny Islands so that he could inform Sora of how his world would soon fall into darkness, and in the meantime wait for an older Sora from 1 year in the future to arrive to Destiny Islands shortly before it would become a sleeping world. He would then place a recusant sigil on the older Sora to allow the new Organization 13 to track him during his Mark of Mastery exam, and then Terra Xehanort's Heartless would go on to see out the events of Kingdom Hearts 1. Wait, what? This is where the Kingdom Hearts series sort of lost me as a fan, and then I became completely disenfranchised with the series by the end of Kingdom Hearts 3. Although a little research does go a long way in clarifying some of the more convoluted aspects of the story, these retcons that constantly throw a "wait, actually" moment in my face feel less and less special with each additional retcon layer. For me, it no longer became satisfying to discover that what I originally knew about a plot element now held some different meaning that I originally didn't know about. Now it became a combination of, let me pull out my crazy detective corkboard wall to see how this makes sense, and, wait, was this really necessary? Again, there's nothing wrong with a retcon when used correctly, but when it doesn't exactly slip seamlessly into the narrative, and it's glaringly obvious that the author only came up with it recently, then it really kills one's immersion and pulls you out of the story. The trick to a retcon is to make it appear as if it had been planned from the very beginning, and in my opinion, both the Illyrio stuff and the Kingdom Hearts time travel stuff definitely fail in that department. There's other retcons in both series, but these are the two biggest blunders that I can think of off the top of my head. I am aware that both Nomura and Martin have a few editors who look over their work and give them advice on how something may read better. However, what I think both editing teams should focus on is giving both authors pointers on how to cut material that isn't necessary for the overall understanding of the story. George, Nomura-san, I know this goes completely against your Gardner mentality, but will this retcon really add all that much to the story? Aren't you satisfied with what you already have? A writer eventually reaches a point of diminishing returns. Sometimes less is more. Again, this last part of this video is my opinion and subjective, but this is what I think, and I think that the more retcons that are added to the series in this ever exponentially growing series will be to its detriment. But what do you think? How do you perceive the retcons in both the A Song of Ice and Fire and the Kingdom Hearts series? Feel free to let me know.
So that about does it for my video essay comparing the similarities between both George R.R. Martin and Tetsuya Nomura. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching all this way, and I hope this video was able to be informative for you as well as slightly entertaining. If you have any thoughts on anything I talked about in this video, or any thoughts in general with regards to George R.R. Martin or Tetsuya Nomura as writers, feel free to chime in the comments section below, ladies and gentlemen. In the meantime, thank you so much again for watching this video. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you guys next time. The Advocate, out.